Now that we understand the different hosting models where our applications can be deployed either as virtual machine or a cloud service or a web app, we need to now understand the other services which are provided by Azure. The most important of all being database services, where we have the choice of either using SQL database or a storage service, or it can be a document DB service. Now, what is this SQL database service? SQL database is a database as a service offering that makes SQL database accessible for cloud developers. See, we generally have SQL server in our premise, and into this SQL server we are going to create our tables, stored procedures, triggers, indexes, and so on. All these things now we are going to create in Azure through SQL database service. This SQL database service is very similar to that of SQL. The syntax is similar. Rather, we can say it is an Azure extension of SQL Server only. And this service, we don't have to provision, we don't have to manage, we don't have to administer. We simply make use of for storing our data, for persisting our data. The contribution by the developer in managing that service is almost zero. And we do get all the benefits of Azure, where replication can be done, geo replication can be done in different locations. It has support for TSQL programming, like you can use ADO.NET the way you would use managed provider for SQL Server. The same managed provider would work here for SQL database. You can as well use native ODBC. You can use PHP or JDBC also for communication with this database. There are many tools which are available for migrating the database from SQL Server to SQL database. Remember, SQL database earlier was referred as SQL Azure, but now we call it as SQL database. Similar to database, we have got storage service. Now, what is this storage service for? This is generally used for massively scalable, durable, and highly available applications so that we can store and process terabytes of data to support big data scenarios requiring scientific, financial, and media applications. So whenever we have large volume of data, very large volume, and we need highly scalable facility, then we should go for storage service. Remember, in storage service, we don't write SQL commands, but we'll be able to store the content of a file. We will be able to have entities stored. We have provision for queues, and we can also store our files. So yes, Azure storage is ideal for very large applications, but at the same time you can also use Azure storage for small applications because you pay only for what you use. Today your application might be small, but with time, with age, it will grow and you will have huge amount of data to be managed. Yes, use Azure storage service for those kind of things which can be managed in it. Can store tens of trillions of unique customer objects and handle millions of requests per second on average. Millions of requests per second. That's the beauty of it. That means storage service is much faster when compared to SQL database. So in storage service, you are going to store your data either as a blob storage, which is a binary content, binary large object, blob storage, or it can be a table storage, non-relational. Remember, non-relational table where entities are going to be stored. That's what is table storage. Queue storage, so that asynchronous application development can happen. One application can post a message into queue and without waiting for it to be processed can continue with next action. And we would have another application which can probably read the message from the queue and process it. And at the same time, we do have file storage. In Azure, what is very important is whether it is virtual machine or cloud services or whether it is app services, all these are supposed to be stateless. Suppose you have deployed your web application on a virtual machine, and if your application writes something into a file, physical file, there is a very good chance that once you deprovision the virtual machine, once you shut down the virtual machine and restart the machine, that file will not be there at all. It's gone. That is the reason we should not have any kind of data stored in file system in any of the deployment models of Azure. But there are many projects, many applications which are already using file system programming. Directory structure like files are used. For those kind of cases, we will create file share and directories and files in Azure storage service. Basically virtual file system is created in storage service, and we can use that for managing our files. But yes, remember, traditional applications would use file storage, but latest applications should use containers and blobs. That is more recommended and more faster. Into blob you can store any kind of file content. It can be image file, it can be media file, that means your MP3, MP4 files, it can be PDFs, it can be configuration files, any kind of file content you can store here. That's why we are calling it as binary large object, blob storage. So yes, you can either use most of the time SQL database or you can use storage service. There is one more service available for especially JavaScript and JSON programmers called as document DB service. This is a NoSQL document database which is designed from ground up to natively support JavaScript and JSON directly in the database engine. See, nowadays client-side programming is getting more and more popular. So in client, objects are created and they take the form of JSON objects. And most of the time it so happens that these JSON objects are converted to a native language and those are further stored in the database. That means a lot of transition is going to happen from JavaScript JSON maybe to, let us say, C# object, and C# object to maybe SQL statement, and that has to be stored in database. Using document DB service, we can bypass all these things. JSON objects can be directly stored into the database itself because the database engine itself is for managing JSON objects, and that is also pretty fast. So it reduces the latency and it's flexible for even querying data from those JSON objects or collection of those JSON objects. So documents DB service is also one of the options for making our data persistent. Apart from this, also there is available a SQL Server virtual machine. That means you can simply provision a virtual machine where proper SQL Server Enterprise Edition will be installed. Good thing is you have to simply do that with a few clicks without really needing to manually deploy SQL Server on your machine which is going to take long time. Quickly, in no time, we can have a SQL Server virtual machine provisioned where our data can be stored. Though it is not really a strong recommendation, instead we will prefer going for something like SQL database as it is a built-in service in Azure and maybe comparatively cheaper also. So these are databases as a service. Likewise, we have got Azure Network Service where we are going to create a virtual network. Now what is virtual network? Virtual network is a representation of your own network in a cloud. Imagine you already have a local network within your organization, on-premise network. That network as it is, you want to extend it to the cloud. That means the IP address series should be extended. The subnet mask should be extended. All that is pretty much possible with the help of virtual network. You can have your own DNS configuration in Azure for your virtual network. You can create IP address blocks so that virtual machines can use only IP addresses in those range. You can create network security groups which are generally useful for creating inbound and outbound rules for the traffic for the virtual machines in that particular virtual network. You can also segment your virtual network into subnets and launch Azure IaaS virtual machine and cloud PaaS role instances. Remember, virtual machines can be either used by infrastructure as a service or even cloud service in background. Remember, uses virtual machine, but that is PaaS instances, role instances which are created. So in essence, with the help of virtual network, you can expand your network to Azure with complete control on IP address blocks with the benefit of enterprise scale what Azure provides. You can also have something called as content delivery network. Now what is this? It is a service to deliver high bandwidth content. For example, if you enable CDN access for storage account in which you use blob, it is stored at a location which is closer to user and thus improves the performance of your performance by using maximum bandwidth. In short, we are going to have our content duplicated into different geographical locations. And based on the user location, the application which is consuming, based on that location, automatically it will communicate with the nearest data center to read the data from there and render it to the user. So content delivery network is also part of Azure services. In addition to that, there are a lot of other very important application services which are provided by Azure, which are built into the Azure platform. These are managed services that we can run to provide a lot of value, so you can avoid setting up these infrastructure for common capabilities. So most of the things which are routine requirement in different applications, they are providing in the form of Azure application services. It can be media service where we provide content in the streaming form for our video files or audio files. Streaming is pretty much possible. Encoding of content from one format to another format, and trying to render content based on the device used on the client. Maybe for tablet, one kind of content will be rendered. For desktop and laptops, another kind of content. Maybe for mobile with low bandwidth, a different type of content we render. All these things can be pretty well done through media service. Then we have got service bus, where applications which are behind the firewalls can also communicate with ease. If you have knowledge of WCF and we try to build applications where services will be used by the client, we can have a lot of problems because of the firewalls. So these things, if you want to make available through cloud, we make use of service bus. So service bus is a generic cloud-based messaging system for connecting just about anything. That means applications, services and devices wherever they are. Connecting apps to run on Azure on-premise system or both. That means your service might be in on-premise and client can be on internet. Service bus will provide access to it. You can have the other way around also. Your application is on-premise and service is outside. Service bus will provide access to it. Sensors, household devices, tablets, phones, all these things can connect to each other because of the service bus. Search service. You have a sophisticated, powerful service which can be used for searching, and that too natural language stack, also used in Bing and Office, is also part of Azure service. Search implementation if you want within your application. Business analytics, generating graphs, generating reports, maps in various formats, maybe Excel, Word, PDF, is possible through business analytics service. We have got a Hadoop plugin, HD Insight. It's an Apache Hadoop based service that lets you analyze data so big that relational database can't handle it. Hadoop can be used, and that service is available here. Caching is another important feature which will improve performance of the application. So we have got Redis caching, and that caching will cache the data in memory. Instead of making trip to database, we can use the cached content from memory and serve it to the application. Again, it improves throughput and performance. Access control. identity information through Facebook, Google Live ID, Windows Live ID. All these things are different identity providers which we can make use of for signing on to our application. Something like single sign-on feature we call it. Azure Active Directory Graph provides programmatic access to read data in Azure Active Directory. Azure has got its own Active Directory where users can be created, roles can be created, and for these users and roles permissions can be granted. And we can manage that through REST API. Azure Authentication Library makes it easy for developers to add their client applications, the logic for authenticating users to Active Directory, and providers of choice. And like this, many more services are there in Azure which are actually being enhanced and managed by Microsoft. We simply need to use them by learning the basic API. So yes, it can be database as a service, network as a service, or CDN, or any of the application service. What is very, very important to know is all these things can be used in all the three different application hosting models, whether it is virtual machine, or it can be web apps, or it can be cloud service. So services is what is the core of Azure. Thank you.